Hey everyone, I would like to welcome you to this evening of conversation in conversation with Dr. Hardwick and Pastor Meghan Dejong. This is a conversation that is near and dear to my heart as well as the two others online. And so I just want to welcome all of you who are watching, who have tuned in, and just say thank you and thank you to our two guests. Before I do further introductions, I would like to do a land acknowledgement of Uptown Chicago. We respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional homelands of the Miami, Peoria, and Potawatomi peoples. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of all original peoples of this region, and we lament the broken promises made to them and their systematic marginalization. And we thank them for their generous hospitality by holding space for them at this gathering. So again, thank you, Dr. Hardwick and Pastor Meghan, for being here. I want to read a little bit about both of these lovely people, just to give you an idea of some of their story. I'm sure as we go along, they'll both tell a little bit more of their stories. So, Dr. Hardwick, today he serves as an autism advocate and conference speaker, helping to educate and train churches and faith communities about autism awareness, acceptance, and advocacy. Dr. Hardwick is a father, husband, pastor, and author. He holds a Master of Divinity degree from Emory University, as well as a Doctor of Ministry degree from Liberty University School of Divinity. In addition, he is a student of the Yale School of Divinity Clergy Program, Scholar Program, and a 2017 graduate of Georgia's Forward's Young Game Changers program, which included 50 of the state of Georgia's top thinkers, innovators, and leaders under the age of 40. Wow. He is the lead pastor of Tri-Cities Church in Atlanta, Georgia. It's quite the resume. Wow.
I am very, very impressed.
I'm impressed too. Wow. You've done a lot. Meghan is a pastor at High Rock, a network of churches in the Boston area. She and her husband Brad are parents to Brady, who's 8, and Luke, who's 5. She started digging into disability theology after Brady was born with Down syndrome and has met God in beautiful ways through meeting the disabled Christ. In her free time, you can find Meghan at her CrossFit gym or watching the Cubs games. Yes. And I am Tiana Coleman.
Terrible year. Even this terrible.
Yeah, even now. I'm Tiana Coleman. I'm one of the pastors at Jesus People Church in Uptown Chicago. And I have a 13-year-old son with autism. And so, again, this conversation is one that is very important to me. I am really grateful for this space that we get to be in together. So let's dive right in. Oh, before we dive right in, everyone please say your name and where you're from, because we have a couple books to give away. So we'll have a raffle. So your name and what city and state you're from. Thank you. So diving in, Dr. Hardwick, I just wanted to say I have read articles about disabilities, especially autism, with having a son who has autism. I have listened to speakers. I have honestly not read a book cover to cover about disabilities. I don't know why. I think some of it is I'm entering in more of a season of reading in seminary and just seeing the need to expand my mind. So when I saw your book, it drew me for a lot of reasons. A Black man talking about his own story. I read it cover to cover because I think I needed to be prepared when I got on here. And so for me, it really brought me into this space of learning new things, of identifying, when I think of my son, there are things in there that I'm like, yes, that's grace. And it also brought me to a space of, there were things I didn't even think of, things I didn't even consider, that by diving into this book, my eyes were open to a lot of things. So really, in this first little bit, I would love you to just to talk about your journey of pursuing what ended up being a diagnosis of autism or being on the spectrum. I left that purposely out of the introduction because I want to hear from you and what that reality, like once you did know what that did for you and what led you to write this book. So really, I just would love to hear about your own journey, if we could start off there.
Sure. Great question. One I get often, especially being diagnosed as an adult. Um, so I was diagnosed at age 36. That was almost 7 years ago now. It was
Mm.
December 2014 when I was diagnosed. Um, but I often tell people that I knew probably around the age of 7 or 8, I started to realize there were some significant differences between me and my peers. Um, I didn't understand a lot of things that they joked about. I didn't understand a lot of behaviors. I didn't really understand people. Um, and so I knew there were some differences there, but I just like most people, particularly autistic people. There's a term called masking, where you tend to just mimic the behaviors of those around you in an
Mm.
effort to fit in, or more so an effort not to stick out.
Mm.
So by the time I got to middle school, I had sort of mastered that, along with other coping strategies that ended up not being so healthy. Um,
Mm.
so some of those things I had to get away from. So I grew up hearing from kids, you sound like a robot, you're angry all the time, your facial expressions, your body language, all coming in kids' language.
Mm.
Um, and so I didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't understand voice intonation, facial expressions, sarcasm, any of those things. I took things very literally. And my mother even says, I think in around third grade, a teacher told her, Lamar is very smart, but there's something wrong with him and I can't figure it out.
Mm.
So, being born in 78, um, there wasn't a whole lot of education about what autism is and what it isn't, particularly because I was verbal, although no one in my family knows when I started talking.
Mm.
So there could have been a speech delay there. I'm not sure.
Okay.
My developmental history is kind of mysterious.
Mm.
Another factor was my father was in the military, so we moved quite a bit.
Yeah.
So even when I was diagnosed at 36, my therapist who diagnosed me believed that a lot of what masked what would have gotten me diagnosed earlier was, one, there was not enough education. Two, honestly, in the African American community, that wasn't something that was talked about. And the third thing is, being in a military family, no one expected me to adjust well,
Mm.
um, especially when we lived in other countries. So a lot of those things, we spent time in Germany, different language,
Mm-hmm.
had to learn a different language. So no one expected me to adjust well. So I sort of stumbled my way through middle school and high school. Did okay academically, but socially was never found my way to fit in.
Mm.
Fast forward and through college and adulthood, I sort of had some success, still stumbled my way through, but really struggled with relationships, jobs. I hold a job for 2, maybe 3 years before
Mm.
people started to figure out that there was something, as they would put it, a little off about me.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I was being considered for the lead pastor role in my former church where I hit what I call a proverbial wall.
Mm.
My predecessor had resigned, and they were considering me to be the lead pastor. At the time, I was a youth and young adult pastor. And I like to joke with people that, all teenagers are socially awkward, so nobody really noticed that I was strange.
There you
And
go.
actually, the youth ministry was
Mm.
thriving because all the
Mm-hmm.
kids in the city who didn't fit in felt comfortable around me. So when I got there, it was about
Mm.
12 kids, and within a year, we had 120 kids.
Oh wow.
All were sort of outcasts like me, so they found a home. But it wasn't until my predecessor resigned and I was asked to preach and teach more in the adult service because the adults liked my preaching.
Mm.
But I heard a lot of disparaging comments about their interactions with me. He
Mm.
walked past me, he didn't speak. He's not very social. And following my predecessor, he was literally a larger than life figure. He was an ex offensive tackle for the Cleveland Browns. So he was
Oh
like
wow.
6'7", 300 pounds, just a big ball of fun.
Wow.
And then you have me who barely talk. People didn't even know that I talked at all.
Mm.
Like my preaching, but they couldn't reconcile how I was not the same person off stage that I was on stage.
Mm.
Uh,
Okay.
So, that period of time was really rough for me. I heard a lot of things that I had always heard, but I was hearing it in adult language.
Mm.
Um, and then a significant point when I was doing my doctorate, I had to ask 7 people who were close to me or worked with me to do an assessment for a class that they made all the pastors take. It was in a psychology department, but they made all the pastors take the class. So we did probably 15 different assessments of ourselves, our personalities, trying to learn who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one exercise. And so a gentleman that I really respected, who was an associate pastor at the church, wrote in his assessment of me, and I quote, "Lamar has a really hard time picking up on social cues. Lamar gets laser focused on one task at a time," and so on and so forth. And his assessment of me literally read like diagnostic criteria.
Wow.
And I honestly, I didn't know what a social cue was. I had never heard that word before. I didn't know there was such thing as body language. So like most people, when you don't know what something is, you Google it. So I Googled social cue,
There you go.
and it just took me down this whole world of people like me who were saying things that resonated with me. I said, this is what people have been saying about me my entire life. I realized that while I didn't like what people were saying about me, I realized everyone can't be wrong. I'm missing something. So I asked myself the question, and I talk about in the book, what do people experience when they experience me? And it was a tough question to ask, but when I had to really face that my interactions with people were not what I thought they were.
Yeah.
I did about a year of my own homework, just reading online. And finally, after about a year, I was pretty sure this is it. And so I went to my wife and told her, I think I know what's going on. I think I know what our communication challenges are. And so she helped me to find someone to assess me. And after about 3 or 4 meetings and a bunch of assessments, asked my wife questions, asked my mother questions, my older sister. Then she confirmed what I had already suspected a year earlier. And I just got an official diagnosis in December of 2014.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So fast forward, because the second part I think was about writing the book. I started very early after that, just writing to process my own journey, unraveling. It's like unraveling those Christmas lights from the year before. My life was a big tangled mess of things I didn't understand. So I was making sense of that. I stayed with that therapist for my wife and I for 2 years, just to help me with that process. And I started writing about it. So that just ended up leading to articles and blogs, and eventually just writing books, because I understood for the first time a lot of the challenges I had with the church
Yeah.
were a part of this developmental disability that I had that I didn't know. And to people's credit, they didn't know either. But I realized that a lot of why I bounced around from church to church and wasn't really accepted was because of that. And I realized that, God has me in a position where, I've kind of stumbled by his grace into being a pastor. And at that stage I was doing well. And it was time for me to try to bridge those two worlds, because I knew if I struggled, there were probably people just like me with the diagnosis or without, who really, really had challenges with the church. And so that just led me to say, I need to write about this and to start lending my voice to an area that was not, at least at the time, there wasn't a lot of people talking about this topic. So it led me into what I feel like was a second part of the calling that God put on my life, not just a pastor, but to bring this critical issue in front of the church and get us talking about it.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, the section where you are talking about, as you're saying it, as you're being vocal, that people all of a sudden are like, wait, I can talk about this. I can bring this to my pastor. And it's interesting because in spaces as a mom of a child with autism, the minute you sort of are just vulnerable and tell people this is my struggle, with even just the sadness of, I thought it was going to look this way and now it's looking this way for Grayson's story, or the joys and that it's going to be okay. People begin to go, oh, I can talk about this. There's somebody that is saying, giving me permission to grieve, giving me permission to to really struggle with this, but also see the really good parts of their child. And I don't know, Megan, if you had that experience at all. I know your son has a different diagnosis. If you want to talk a little bit about Brady.
I mean, I have to imagine it's different, right? And I will just admit that I can only speak from like my experience, right? I don't. One of the things I'm really trying to pay attention to is like, where am I giving Brady places to speak for himself and not superimpose my own stuff on him. And so please just like forgive me as I sort of just try to speak from my experience, I guess, in that. But his disability is visible. And so I think it probably is different. There are ways that you can tell when he walks in a room that something is different. And so I think at this age, this is where I see some differentiation really starting to happen. Where before some of it is like charming and endearing and it's cute even. Like he's a cute kid.
He's super cute.
And so I find choosing to lean into vulnerability is super hard for me. It's I was telling friends before this conversation makes me more nervous than any of the other hard conversations because it's so personal for me. It's like the soft spot that someone could totally take advantage of, and if they wanted to, and thanks be to God, like that's not normally what happens. People are not weaponizing any of that vulnerability, but there is that fear of like, soon as you kind of like let your guard down, you're going to get hurt. And it's not because people are malicious. It's just because this is something you don't talk about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or I've also experienced, if we are talking about it, it's I mean, if it's our safe crew, if it's our small community, then that's a safe space. But in other places, it's like, it's not the topic, or it's every kid has been invited except for Grayson. That happened once, and it was just like, but more and more to bring it to light, I think is so important. And I think Dr. Hardwick, you being vocal brought it to light for people. And I think the more that we do that, and the more that we normalize something that, these are people that need to be included. These are people that have something to teach us. I think that's where we will see the church do something different. At least I hope so. So moving on, in your introduction, see, we're only at the introduction. We're not going to do every chapter, even though I'm so tempted to. I go through each chapter and let me find a question. I love the name of your introduction. It's called A Love Letter to the Church from an Autistic Pastor. I just love that, because you really do go in, and you, throughout the whole book, you're just like, I'm just going to be real, and I'm going to confront things. And I appreciate that straightforward. In general, I appreciate people being straightforward like that, but in this book in particular, you're just like, here's some realities. But you give personification to the church, which I love. And so I do want to read a section that, half the book's highlighted, but I do want to read a section that really jumped out at me as you're talking about your journey, which we've already talked a little bit about, how you came to your diagnosis and, the work since then. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a few sentences. You're talking about the church. Like me, the church has excelled despite her difficulties. She is indeed a great institution. She has grown up and had a lot of success, but she has still struggled, and many of her self-taught coping strategies are no longer working. I believe that, much like my story, her story of success has finally driven her into the spotlight. And with that spotlight comes the need to address some deep internal struggles. And as you go on to talk about statistics, I'll read a couple, but I think we're hitting on the internal struggles as we read these statistics. It's sort of like, okay, wow. But you talk about 84% of families impacted by autism, or 84 are more likely to never attend religious services due to a felt lack of inclusion. Other studies, you talk about 46% of families impacted by disability have never been asked how their child and family could be included in the life of the church. And then later on, you talk about a statistic from 2010, so this is like a couple chapters in the book, into the book, that 1 in 5 people have a disability. And so, looking at these percentages, you talking about the church and her deep struggles, and what we're probably seeing as one of her deep struggles, that lack of inclusion, even at this early stage in the book, because we're only in the introduction, what do we need to start thinking about as far as the church and inclusiveness? And how can we even now start to have a transformative way of thinking about how we see people, how we include people? I'm just wondering, again, we're early in the book, but, and you give us a lot of good tools throughout the book, but how can, even at this stage of somebody being like, I didn't know those stats, I didn't know those facts, how can we start changing our mindset as the church? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is, and I hit on it, I can't remember which chapter, maybe 1 or 2, where I talk about, and I'm assuming, our viewers and our listeners know the story of the lost sheep, and the shepherd going after the one. And I make a statement in there that, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to misquote my own book. One of the things I joke about with people is, just a side note, by the time the book hits your hands, it's probably 3 years old to the author.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people ask me things and they'll think I'm being funny. I'm like, I wrote that like 3 years ago. So it's like a 2-year process to, so I know the book, but sometimes I'm like, what did I say on that page? Because that was 3 years ago.
Yes.
But, just to paraphrase, I talked about, the question is, our mission is who's missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even if you have a periphery knowledge of those statistics, or not even at all, just look around your church. And that'll tell you that there are certain groups. I think, especially in the West, we get caught in the trap of, how many butts are in the seats and those types of things. We measure success in that way. But one of the ways that I try to help us to become aware, even if you're not very knowledgeable about this topic, is, if it's true, it's 1 in 5. And, again, that was 2010. We've done a new census since then. I suspect that number is actually going to change, especially with COVID. Some people are going to come out of it with conditions that they didn't have before. So that's 1 in 5. That's 20%. It's the largest minority group in the world.
Wow.
So even if you have a periphery knowledge of these issues, or not at all, just look around. Look around in your church, and see that it's not a very well represented group in the local churches. So that in and of itself, I'm hoping will spark a level of curiosity to say, why is this population largely missing from our churches? Because 1 in 5 is not a very large number. And also, I would say, to help people to understand this and kind of change their mind and bring awareness to it, we know that the disability community is in our communities where our local churches are, because the school systems are serving the children and the teenagers. There's organizations in your community that are serving that population. It's only the church that is usually lagging behind on that. And so we can't say that even though we've tried to make them invisible, we can't say that we don't know that they're in our communities, because other organizations are showing us they're in our communities, they're in our schools. There's literally hundreds of kids that have IEPs. There's other organizations in the community. So I think the church just needs to open their eyes, maybe talk to some of these other organizations that are in our communities that are doing great work, and realize that the disability community is going everywhere but the church to get support. And that's an indictment on the church.
Okay.
I just also feel like the church has got to say sorry for the ways that they have actively tried to move away from serving those communities. Like the way that religious organizations are exempt from ADA. And I see many faithful churches trying to meet compliance standards and do what they can And so I was so grateful for your book and the very practical ways you laid out. Like, it doesn't have to be so scary. I know it feels daunting, but it doesn't have to be. Your tips in there are amazing. But from a pastoral perspective, like, that is a thing I just hope that churches can learn in this season, especially coming as like a white pastor in a like white majority church. We've had to do a lot of repenting this year. And so to say, okay, this is a posture that we are invited to, knowing that there's grace on the other side, but you got to start somewhere. Yeah.
That's good, Megan. And speaking to that, I was thinking how sometimes folks will say, I've heard this at the end of Sankofa trips more than once. I'm calling people out now. Like, oh, we already have this program going, or oh, how are we going to do, add that, racism issues, or so I kind of feel like I've heard a similar, or would hear a similar question or regard to disability, like, oh, we already have this going on, how are we going to make space? But to me, it feels like the answer is, if people are not included, I don't care what's going on, make space for them at the table. And it's not about programs, it's about who's missing, and how do we say, we're going to make this table longer, or we're going to add one more chair, we're going to squeeze in. So I don't know if you all have thoughts on that, but I just feel like sometimes there's this, we already got 20 programs going, and to add one more. And, on our Sankofa trip, as a person of color, when people were saying that, I was a little bit like, excuse me, you figure it out, because, it makes a difference if there are people of color who feel like they don't belong. So I feel like it's a similar thinking of, when people are like, oh, I don't know, or I've never, you make that space for them. So just, do you all have any thoughts about that, or just?
Yeah, it's a very complex question to answer, so I'll do my best to be concise. One of the things I talk about in the book is the parable of the banquet, and how Jesus says, both at the, he's at a feast, a literal dinner party, and then he tells a story about a banquet at this banquet. And in a nutshell, he sends the servant out after the first bit of people decline the invitation in the story. It says, invite the blind, the lame, the crippled, and the poor, those that have been marginalized. And when the servant invites those, he comes back and says, I've done as you've asked, and there's still room for more. And what I tell pastors and churches is, the reason why it's so hard to fit that in your conversation about the disability community, is hard to fit in your vision, your budget, your conversation. It just seems like one more thing. It's because we built it backwards. If we built it the way that Jesus said, there's always room for everything else you want to do in your church. It feels like it's squeezing something extra in because we built the church backwards. And so until we make that community a priority, it's always going to feel like one extra thing to do. How do we fit this in our budget? I have lots of pastor friends, and I talk about this in the book, and we talk about a lot of great things, theology and politics, and disability almost never comes up. It's very hard to fit that in a conversation. These are people that I love, I've known for years, and went to seminary with them. But I realize it's because we built the church backwards. So it's always going to be a hard conversation to have. It's always going to be hard to fit in your budget. And what's interesting about it is that Jesus says, before he tells the story, when he tells all the people at the dinner party, don't sit in the seats of honor unless somebody's gonna, someone may come in and tell you to move. And that's kind of like the spiritual equivalent of sitting at the grown-up table and then being asked to move to the kids table, right? It's like, what are you doing in this seat? That's not your, go to the kids table. The card table that has the Kool-Aid
way in the corner.
And you're like 21 and you're still sitting there 8-year-olds. Right? But Jesus is saying, look, the seats have been stolen. And it's time for the church to return them to their rightful place. So Jesus, anytime you see Jesus at a dinner party in the biblical text, it doesn't have to be his house. I mean, he didn't have a house, but he's always the host.
Yes.
Right. So
it's true.
So it doesn't matter that it was somebody else's house. He's the host. So he's going to arrange the seats and assign the seats. And his priority was go out, invite the lame, the blind, the crippled, the poor. And he says, don't invite the people who can, repay you. And I think a lot of how our churches are built is built on that premise that there's an assumed value that comes from able-bodied people because they are able to pay for these things that we're doing.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other topic, but Jesus
Next
says,
time.
but Jesus says, invite this marginalized community first, and then God himself is responsible for the reimbursement. So there's a whole, I tell pastors, you think your church is great. Look at us, we have 2,000 members. But Jesus is saying, but there's a whole level of blessing on your organization that does not exist, that you're not even inviting God to be a part of because you built it backwards. So imagine how great your church would be if we built it the right way. And it invites this blessing on the organization and on the programs. And then there's still room for everything else that you want to do. And so, but that's part of the mysterious developmental history that I'm talking about. You've had primarily one set of voices, especially in the Western church, who have decided what church should look like.
Yeah.
And there have been many marginalized voices that have never had a say so. And I can say that with race. Like I tell people all the time, the Black church was not the black people's invention. We created it because there was nowhere else for us to go. And it's been the same thing with the disability community. They've been displaced from having a seat at the table that Jesus says belongs to them. And so I think, we really got to wrestle with that and understand that, at some point we're going to have to shift. And so what I've encouraged pastors with, because I try to be encouraging, is, as we re-enter after post-COVID, let's not just re-enter, let's rebuild.
Yes.
We have a tremendous opportunity here to go back and change things, because for the last almost year plus, accessibility has been an everybody issue. And the church, I hate to say this, but we watched the church get very creative. They found the money to make sure that they were including people.
Yes, they did.
And what I have called the church out on is saying, the disability community is watching. And what we have inadvertently told them and shown them is that we could have done this the whole time. So we have a chance here to not just re-enter, but to rebuild, and they're watching, and we need to, take this as an opportunity to do the right thing.
That is a good and challenging word. Wow, you're preaching tonight. All right, so we've had a couple questions come in, and folks, drop your questions in the chat, and they will come to me. Why do you think the church gets behind, that's in quotes, so often? Some of it you explained a little bit, but maybe a little more expounding on that.
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer, then I'll punt to Meghan. So I want to hear what she thinks.
Oh boy.
I think the church as a whole has just not been very forward thinking on a lot of issues, not just this issue. We're the last ones to engage in any sort of updates or upgrades on how we approach things. I think a part of it is this idea that we still wrestle with, the scripture being in the world and not of the world. And so I think the church in a lot of ways resists new methods, new ways of thinking. We, especially in the West, we resist new minds, new thoughts. So if you notice, anytime, and this is even now, like anytime a segment of the church rises up with a very valid but very different opinion and theology about the church, and they bring historical context, we find ourselves traditionally coming up with labels for it. And so and then we engage for another decade in infighting instead of saying, you have a valid point here. And so you've seen that generation after generation, whether it's, I'll stop myself right there. But you see it, you can pick up what I'm putting down. You see it every 10 years or so. There's a label that's slapped on people who have a different idea or approach, who have valid concerns. And when I tell people, all theology is contextual and all theology is a response. So, similar to my statement about, the historically Black church was not enslaved Africans' invention. It was a response to not being welcome. Up until that point, all churches were multicultural. It's just there was a lot of racism.
Yeah.
And so when the Black church was invented, it was as a response of not being welcome. And so you see historically, there's always a response to, and I'll just say this, to what I have found to be a lot of bad teaching, right? And you get responses to that. The problem is that the reason why the church lags behind is because when those responses come from valid places, from valid voices who have a lot of history to back up what they're saying, we engage in infighting instead of accepting the fact that this is a part of the mysterious development of history that I'm talking about that we need to address. And we need to ask ourselves the question, what do these groups experience when they experience the church? We don't ask that because I think sometimes we don't care. And then my last statement on that is Jesus even did this, right? We over spiritualize this moment in his ministry when he sat down with his disciples and said, who do people say that I am? Right? He's getting his fingers on the pulse of how are people receiving us? What's the word on the street? Right?
Yeah.
It's asking the question, what is people's experience with this ministry? We got a following, but I want to know, what are people's perception? And I think the church is probably one of the only organizations who oftentimes does not care about the people that they say they're trying to serve. If you go to a restaurant, to a department store, they will give you a survey and say, how are we doing? We want to know, how are we treating you? Is it clean? It's only the church who says, we want you to come. We just don't care what you think about us. And that's caused us to lag behind in being progressive in any way, because we don't ask that critical question that I talk about in the beginning of the book. What do people experience when they experience us? Because it's not what we said it is. And your brand is not what you say you are. It's what the people you're trying to reach say you are. And I think that's one of the things that the church has to adjust and figure out, why is it that the disability community or other communities have these things to say about the church? Because that's their experience with the church.
Yeah.
And we need to accept that, and we need to adjust.
Thank you. Wow. Megan, you got some thoughts there to add to?
I mean, I'm really struck. These two things keep coming into my brain. One, you have a section on a biblical vision for diversity that you speak to, that has these like 5 points that I feel like if we could really like get at that is the counterbalance to what you're talking about, of just sort of like keeping like homogeny for the sake of safety. Some sort of we feel like we need to do self-preservation, and maybe the church has been in that sort of like state since the Reformation, when we decided to like make our faith like an individual choice rather than a collective identity. And then I will even like go so far as to say that the whole history of like the white church in the United States is all about self-preservation. But it's the second point that I'm like thinking of is like the preservation of power. And Willie Jennings in his Acts commentary like continues to bring up the idea that the power of the Holy Spirit was always meant to be the source of life and power for the church. And somewhere along the way, like we forgot to trust that. And so I just wonder that why have we decided to adopt techniques that are driven on trying to like leverage influence or power at the cost of other people? And it's easiest to leverage power against people that are already disadvantaged in like the legal and social structures of our society. So it's sort of just like the bully in the corner, piling on. And so the work of getting ahead of it, it's just taking an opposite approach It has nothing to do with self-preservation. Like Jesus already preserved and redeemed everything. We don't have
Yes.
anything, to fight for. But it's scary. It's really, and I really appreciated in your book, Dr. Hardwick, talk about the implications of a shifting theology of disability. There are real implications when we talk about what do we think about disabled people and salvation and heaven, and what do we think about disabled bodies? Like when you really start going down there, there are serious implications. And so I'm not saying it's not scary for folks when they start to cross that, but it's actual lives at stake, I think, in all of these things. And so, do we think these lives are worth pursuing and being in solidarity with, at the cost of our discomfort or shifting ideas?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. All right. I have a lot of questions. I'm like, okay, time is flying. I actually want to read or talk about. I told Meghan I could hardly get through this section without getting weepy-eyed, but in just talking about disabled bodies, I'm just trying to find my paper. Page 86. So you tell this story about this woman, Sandra, who is diagnosed with autism, and she has a vision impairment. And I love this story because she identifies people by their scent. And I just want to read this section, and I think I can get through it without sobbing. I just thought it was just so beautiful. When asked about her views of heaven and disability, Sandra remarked, "I know all of you are looking forward to seeing Jesus in heaven, but I can't wait to smell him." For Sandra and many other people with disabilities, the way they use their body to navigate the world is a vital part of their identity. And I loved that section. I think as somebody who would be, considered able-bodied, it's like, yes, I don't think exactly like this person over here, but because I have all my senses, I can smell things, I can see things, I approach life a certain way. But to hear about somebody who doesn't have all these, different things, that can't see quite well, and just the way she wants to smell him, she wants to know his scent, it was so beautiful. And so I'm wondering too, in thinking about Sandra and others, like what we think about too, that creative part or that different part of seeing Jesus, and even the way the church can sort of invite that part in, like a different way of seeing things. It doesn't have to be how Tiana sees it. Like, my biggest hope is that people would know he's brown skinned, and that's legit. I know that's legitimate, but his scent is like, I literally was like, I never even thought about that. But if you can't, if you're visually impaired, you're going to think like that. So are we missing something with sort of that creative, with not having these folks at the table, that creative, different way of seeing Jesus and seeing his people? And just if either of you want to speak to that, because that story like I said, I was boo-hooing because I was just so blessed by a different way of experiencing Jesus. So.
Yeah, I think the thing that the church has not been, so let me back up. I said this in the beginning, a lot of things I say about the church is because I love the church. I consider myself an apologist for the local church. So I don't want anyone to consider me one of those people who just rail on the church. No, I love the church. The church is plan A. Jesus put all his eggs in that basket, right? He says, I'm going to give the keys to the kingdom to you all. There's no plan B. So I'm in it for the long haul. But at the same time, there's some things that I think, the church has gotten wrong. So as you talk about that, one of the things that I've noticed about the church is that, we believe in the incarnation. We believe that, God embodied himself in human flesh. Yet somehow we still have this resistance to us recognizing that in our human experience, we don't just have bodies, we are our bodies. Right. And if that's true, then we have to realize that all of our experiences with each other, with this world, and even with God are part of our embodied experience. And oftentimes it's an afterthought for able-bodied people because they don't realize that persons with disabilities experience God through the body that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And it oftentimes brings a much different experience. You talk about the creativity, it brings a different aspect, it brings a different experience, different expressions, different language about how we experience God, because none of us escape that. Our experiences with life, faith, and each other are all part of our embodied experience. So when Sandra says she can't wait to smell him, and I talk about this in the book, many people with disabilities, particularly if they have physical disabilities, have very different experiences with the world, but also in their relationship with faith. And so I do think we do miss that. One of the things I talk about in the book is that, and this is later on in the book, one of the primary images in the New Testament is this contest between flesh and spirit, right? What I tell people is, for me, that's a real thing. That's not just an idea, right? It's not just an image. My brain oftentimes does things with sensory processing, social anxiety. Sights and sounds can be too loud for me. Some days it's so overwhelming, I could spend the next few days in bed. That's a very real thing for me. So I tell people my faith is often leading a rebellion against my body because my body's telling me things that I can't do. My faith is leading a rebellion. And so even that concept of spirit and flesh, that's a real thing for people with disabilities. That's a very lived, embodied experience. It's not just an idea on paper. Every day they live in a world where they have to manage between their faith and what their body can or cannot do, sometimes momentarily, temporarily, in that moment, seasonally, right? But who better to help teach the church and bring that imagery and those experiences to help deepen our faith in persons who don't just live that as an idea, but live that in practice. So Sandra is one of those examples, right? Her eyes are not allowing her to see in the way that other people see, maybe not even at all, but she's learned to live an embodied experience of faith. And so for her, dissent is something that is important. And I even say in the book, one of the questions I have is, for those of us who've learned how to use our bodies, and I'm making an analogy about when I tore my Achilles tendon, and for a year plus, I had to learn how to use my body differently. And it was a pain. Imagine getting to heaven and been given a body that you don't know how to use because you spent your entire life using it a certain way and you're comfortable using it that way. And everything that you've experienced in the world up until that point has been an embodied experience. I tell people, autism is one of those unique things because it's a part of my neurology. I don't know how you separate that out and me not still be me. The reason I can write the way I write, the reason I see scriptures the way I see scripture, the reason I can preach the way that I preach, the insights that people seem to appreciate, all that is a part of my embodied experience, which includes my disability. If you take that away, I'm not sure I'm the same person. And so my thought is that there is a depth of creativity there in those embodied experiences that the church is missing, because we still have this, and I talk about in the book, we still have this adversarial relationship with the bodies that God has given us from the beginning, right? The very first thing that Adam and Eve did was hide. Why? Why are we hiding that? God is very aware, and he, like he told Moses, I know who made your mouth. I did that. Now I'm going to give you an accommodation to help you live out your call, but I still very much need the creativity and your lived experience in being able to help bring my message to people. And I think the church misses that. So I think you're right. We need to invite more of that into the church and see if it doesn't help deepen our relationship and then deepen our faith and our theology and our understanding of God, when you have people with different lived experiences who can express faith in a different way.
That's great.
And can we call them equally valid? That's like the other piece of that I did. That my secondary prayer in that. Like, I'm over here like trying to not weep. What you're saying is so beautiful. So thank you.
All right, a couple more questions. But before we get to these questions, if you can tell us what your name is and where you're from, we have 2 books we're giving away. So get your name in there so that we can raffle them off. Let's see. Oh, this is good. Well, Megan, actually, you had a question. So did you have something? I just want to make sure before we go.
I feel like you addressed it actually
Okay.
in this last thing, so I don't have it anymore.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. This question is, how can we make church more accessible for those with neurodiversities? That's good.
Yeah, so I saw a quote from a friend the other day that I'll start with. He said that disability ministry is more like a crock pot than a microwave. And I thought that is so good because a lot of times when I do conferences, and it's a valid question, but sometimes people are looking for, and it's part of how we're taught in church today. We're looking for, give me 5 things that I can do right now that's gonna it's gonna make my church, and it's very much a long process. Like even in the church I pastor now, I tell people the book is a vision. That's why it's very idealistic.
Did we lose you, Pastor? Uh-oh, we lost you.
There's
we have there we go. There you are. Oh, we can't hear you. What happened? Because Megan, I can hear you, right? Like you're still good?
Yes, I can. Yeah,
okay.
I can hear you. No, I can read your lips. You have a really good radio voice too, so this is gonna be a real bummer.
Oh, we were nearing the end, but we weren't quite there yet.
I mean, they're like the gifts and the frustrations of technology.
Right. Available to more people, but okay. Yes. Now you're on mute, as you probably know. You want to unmute and see if...
I think you froze. Oh, he's back. See if your Zoom, can you unmute your Zoom at all? No.
Okay, so you're unmuted.
Okay.
Okay.
You're back.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It was the Zoom thing. It was like making me put my password in.
Oh gosh, Zoom. They've been doing good, but
yeah, it was very strange. They totally cut my mic off. So
I'm sorry.
I apologize for that.
That's okay. It happens. So we were answering the question, or you were answering the question, how can we make church more accessible for those who are with neurodiversities?
Yeah, so I'll give a quick answer, even though it's not a quick fix. And I talk about this in my book. One of the best ways to make the church disability inclusive altogether, not just specifically neurodiverse, is to invite persons with disabilities to be a part of the leadership of the church and give them real roles and help them to shape the church. So if you take that same principle, if you're looking to make your church more neurodiverse, you got to have some neurodiverse people who are helping to shape the church, right? So, and again, most of how we do church in the West is because we've had the same type of minds saying this is what church looks like. So you can go to almost any church in the West, and I say the West, not just America, but Canada, and most of them look the same. We have the same sort of format. Most of us do the same kind of music, depending on the ethnicity. And 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 most of those gatherings were constructed by minds who didn't include persons with disabilities. So it's no wonder why it's not very inclusive, because we never brought them to the table to say,
Right.
what is it? What should this look like for someone who is challenged with what you're challenged with? So, my church, even though I've only been there 2 years, and COVID has eaten up the last, you know, 15 months of that.
Right.
But so we were on the path. The church I pastored prior to that, we did a lot of work in this area, and so I was bringing this same the same strategies to my new church. So we haven't quite got where we wanted to, because COVID shut everything down. But you'll find it to be more inclusive of persons with neurodiversity, because the pastor is neurodiverse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nothing happens in a church that's not important to the pastor and the leaders. So in order for that to be done, you've got to make persons who are neurodiverse leaders. They'll tell you that this is too loud. A great example is most churches will do what's called a meet and greet time, where people, pre-COVID, where
Yeah.
people get up and hug each other and shake hands, and that'll be an official part of the service. I got rid of that. One, I have extreme social anxiety. Like, I don't like people touching me. I don't like forced hugs. But I also did a straw poll, and we had a large number of people in our church who didn't like that either.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, the guests don't like it. So,
Like, who are you? Why are you hugging me?
we keep doing these things.
Yeah.
And I know that. So there's ways to accomplish that need for physical touch, and in the church, without making it an official part of the service that puts people out. And what I discovered is, it wasn't just me. We had a whole group of people who we complained about them coming late, but they were coming late because they wanted to miss that part of the service.
Right.
So they were showing up after praise and worship, and not because they didn't like the music, is they were intentionally trying to skip on the part that made them extremely uncomfortable.
Right.
People who had OCD or sensory processing issues or social anxiety, anxiety disorders, those were all the people that we found that were missing that part of the service. But it started with having someone like myself, and even I had a staff member who had an anxiety disorder, and other people who said, we're not really feeling that part of the service. And there's a large number of people who will never tell you this, but that's why they come late. And I started asking people. So you got to have people who you're trying to reach also leading the effort in changing the way that you do church. Otherwise, it'll never last. And you won't really get the information that you need to make it more inclusive of persons who are neurodiverse. So start there. Even if they don't go to your church, get their input. Ask them to come as a secret shopper one Sunday. And give you ideas about things that are barriers for them, and then listen intently and make those adjustments.
That's really good. Thank you. So we have another question came in. To what degree, if at all, do we as a church need to let go of an expectation of high-level production in order to create authentic hospitality?
To what degree? I would say almost to every degree. There's some things that honestly you're just going to have to stop doing, because they're just not conducive to being inclusive of persons with disabilities. And again, the reason why it's hard to do that is because we never asked those people in the first place what were barriers for them. A quick example, and I give a lot of examples from my previous church, because I was there for 9 years, and I'm taking on this new church again, doing the same thing that I did at my last church. But one of the things that I noticed is that we had a lot of our elderly people that had physical disabilities. Primarily, they're not ambulatory, so a lot of them use walkers and wheelchairs. So we had a sort of a modern auditorium, and there were wings in the back, and it was a movie theater style, auditorium style, where there's a slope walking down to the front. Well, most of them, because they didn't walk very well, they didn't want to go all the way down to the front. So most of them sat in the wings. So after talking to them, I discovered that it was too dark back there, because we dropped the house lights and it's got to be this way. And eventually I told the team, no, keep the lights up at least 30% in the wings. Why? It's going to run. I said, well, it might, I'm sorry, but that's where our people who are elderly, have disabilities sit. I don't want them to fall. They need to be able to see. And so whether or not it ruins the environment or the atmosphere is secondary to me. They need to be able to sit there and be comfortable there. And that was also another reason why some of them were coming in late, is because, the house lights would come up a little bit higher once the preaching started. And so it was a barrier for them. And it meant that we had to stop doing the rock show because it just wasn't conducive to allowing them to be able to sit comfortably and not, falling because it was too dark. And so, there are some things that you're just going to have to stop doing and be okay with it if you're really trying to become more inclusive of persons with disabilities. Some of the things that we do just have to stop. And I hate to say it that way, but the problem is we never ask them. And so if you ask them, they'll tell you these are the reasons why we don't come. And if you really want them there, there's some things that you're going to have to stop.
Oh, that's so good, and in some ways so practical. But I think we get, or maybe we just get caught up in how we think things should be. And like you said, the rock show, or this certain way of doing things. When if we're caring for each other, we're going to ask the questions, and if we're also just being aware of who's there, and again, who's not there. That some of those things we're just going to have to go by the wayside. And you can go to a rock concert. You can do that separately. Right. It doesn't have to be in the church where you want people to be.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I can give a magic pill, but honestly, there's just some things that we're going to have to say, we're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah. No, that's.
And I think
really
I find it an interesting thing. The church where I serve, we wrestle with that question of like, who is God calling us to be inclusive of, right? Because what you're suggesting is going to be inclusive of disabled people. And it will feel uncomfortable for people who are used to something else, right? And so how do we, and this is a question I ask, how do we disciple folks to choose being uncomfortable? Who you could go to any church and you would not necessarily be uncomfortable, but you're going to come to our church and you'll feel a little uncomfortable, but it's for this greater kingdom vision. I think that, like, I'm assuming folks who are watching have a heart for this, or are curious, or have somebody in their life, or themselves are disabled and are asking that question. And then there's a whole lot of people that aren't watching this, who aren't asking those questions. And so that's an active thing that I'm just like, it will feel costly, but can we? And I think your book does an amazing job of painting a beautiful picture of what could be, that I hope is compelling to folks who might feel like, oh gosh, this would be too great a cost. It's like, no, it's worth everything.
Yeah. That's good, Megan. Well, folks, we are at the hour mark. And I think what we're going to do as far as the raffle, that we'll probably just reach out to them separately. Like, we'll just grab names, because we have YouTube and Facebook. So we'll reach out to them separately and send somebody a book from in each category. But before we go, there's two things. I'm wondering from each of you if I can, knowing we have church leaders and pastors and others on, especially since we're talking about the church, what final words, whether it's based on the book, or just, maybe Dr. Hardwick, you're working on your next book and you have some thoughts that didn't make it into this one, but I would love to hear from both of you some final thoughts, and then Pastor Megan will pray for you, Dr. Hardwick, just in this season of busyness and continued healing. But first, can I just hear from each of you just some final thoughts on our time or this book? Maybe we'll start with Megan.
Yeah, I'll go first, because you need to have the final word here. Read this book. Honestly, read this book. I have read so much disability theology, and this book, if you have to start somewhere, start here. So if you have questions, start here. And if you don't know a disabled person, just try. That's just a place to start. That would be my only last thing to say.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think my final word would be I think the church needs to sit up and pay attention. Um, this is going to become even more of a prevalent issue, and I alluded to this earlier.
Mm,
But as we look at how COVID has ravaged our world, our country, we're starting to learn now about those who are being termed long haulers, but those long haul
mm,
symptoms are going to turn into lifetime
yeah.
conditions. So I'm already starting to hear from people I know that are having breathing conditions that they didn't have before. And all those will fall under the umbrella of disability. So I think that 1 in 5 is going to change.
Mm,
Um, so it's going to be an issue that the church can't continue to run from. It's going to be front and center. And as we
mm-hmm,
talk about, being diverse, we focus a lot on racial and ethnic diversity.
mm-hmm,
But again, the largest minority group in the world are persons with disabilities. So we
mm-hmm.
we really cannot have that conversation and continue that pursuit without focusing on this community, which
Mm,
I believe in the next 3 or 5 years is going to become even larger.
yeah.
Um, and I say in the book, it's the only minority group that you can join at any time for any reason.
Hmm.
Mm, hmm.
So
Wow.
this is closer to home than a lot of people think it is.
Yeah.
And we need to pay attention and to start to make the necessary adjustments because this is an issue that's not going away. It's going to become more prevalent in our
Yeah.
communities.
That's good. Thank you. And I mean, you do get the final word, but I want to say one little little thing. Um, I've been encouraged to say that on the Jesus People Facebook page, I did write a blog post about my son Grayson, who is 13 and was diagnosed with autism at 3. So if you all want to take a peek on that, just a little something I wrote. But this time has been really special and has been reading this book has been a wonderful experience that I would say personally, I want it to be more than just an experience. As somebody who is a church leader, as somebody who is a mother of a child with autism, as somebody who cares about this community deeply, I want this to go beyond this time. And I really hope that as people who are listening in, especially like I said, the leaders amongst us, that we can do the work, we can make the space. And I'm just so grateful for the two of you being on tonight and saying yes to this conversation. And Dr. Hardwick, just thank you for all that you have shared with us in your book and in other places. And I just, I'm so grateful for your life and your ministry. So thank you for that. And Pastor Megan, will you close us out in prayer, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
God, what a gift that you have given us this time, that you've given us this technology, and that you have called Pastor Hardwick to this time in this season, Lord, where you knew that we needed this voice. Um, and so, God, I am thankful for his heart, for his mind, exactly as it is, for the ways that he brings perspective to your word and a love for your church that is palpable. God, I thank you for his ministry and for the reconciling work that he is doing now in 2 churches that have become places that are safe, where disabled folks can be known and loved and seen for exactly who you have created them to be. Lord, I pray that that vision would multiply in churches across the world, that we might be able to know you more fully because we know the Christ that was crucified, was risen, and presented his body, his disabled body, to be known, to be that manifestation of your glory in the world. Um, and so, Lord, I just pray a blessing on Dr. Hardwick as his treatments, hopefully, God, that they are done, that you might continue to use his life as you would. But I also I pray for moments of rest in this book launch season, in the middle of doing ministry in a pandemic, caring for other people, being a husband, being a father. That you might seek out those places that he could meet you for rest, so that his ministry might be multiplied. And so, God, I pray that for the folks who are listening tonight, that they might leave here with a word from you, one charge, one invitation to just know you more deeply, to be known and loved by you more deeply, so that they might go into the world and do that same thing. And I thank you, God, for our wonderful host, Tiana, for her heart for you, for the way that you have changed her through Grayson, and her calling and her using this platform to have this wonderful conversation tonight. And so just blessings on tonight, Jesus. We pray all this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, friends. And good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.